All right. All right. Well, first, thank you so much. I want to welcome all of you to our discussion this afternoon. We have some really wonderful panelists. So I hope that all of you find this discussion interesting and informative. I just want to give a little bit of background before we start. So this is a Day of Unity program. Day of Unity is a program of the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington. This is our third Day of Unity. And Day of Unity is really an opportunity for communities to come together in a grassroots kind of way to do some kind of interfaith programming. It's a very decentralized program. We just provide the framework, and then people can do whatever kind of programs they may want to do with other members of other faith communities. And this year, as last year, we actually have 18 give or take a few events that are happening all around the region today on the actual Day of Unity, as well as a few that are happening into the coming weeks. So I hope if you're interested, you can visit us on our website and you can see the whole list of programming that's happening today and other so if you want to join other programs later today after this one or want to come to some next week, that would be wonderful. But it's really just a way for us to uplift all of the wonderful things that are happening around the region in terms of interfaith cooperation and celebration of the diversity that exists where we live. So the program today will be about an hour and 15 minutes. There will be two discussion sections with our panelists, and then we will open it up for Q&A. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to type it into the chat function on the Zoom, and we will, when we get to the Q&A, we will look at those questions that you've typed in. You can type the questions in whenever you want, and then when we get to the Q&A portion, we will look at the questions and ask them of our panelists. You know, if you need to leave in the middle of the discussion, that's totally fine. We understand that people have other things that they need to do, so don't worry about that. And before we get started, I also wanted to remind everyone who is in the audience, all our participants, to please mute your mics so that the only things that we'll hear are our panelists. With that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our wonderful moderator, Melody Fox Ahmed, who is the Director of Global Programs at the National Cathedral School. She will be moderating both parts of the discussion today. And with that, I will turn it over to her. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Semi. Thank you everyone for joining us. I want to say Assalamu alaikum, shalom, namaste. Peace be with you this wonderful Sunday. It's great that we can still have these wonderful community events put on by the Interfaith Council, even when we're all together apart like this. So welcome everyone. So today we have a very important discussion on how to combat stereotypes. So the theme is no hate in the DMV. So we have two big themes that we want our speakers to think about and address in their remarks. I'm going to just address them momentarily. We're going to be talking about some of the common stereotypes that are used against our communities. And then we really want you to come away with some concrete things that you can say or do in the moment to combat stereotypes when we come away with them. You know, I think we have all heard stereotypes. We have probably used them, whether we want to or not, whether we mean to be hurtful or not. I was just watching this show called Ramy, R-A-M-Y, on Hulu. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's really good. It's about like a young Muslim guy in Jersey City. It's really funny. And he and his uncle are fighting with like this guy on the street who he thought was yelling at a woman. And they come away from this encounter and the uncle goes, "I could tell by the way that guy was driving that he was a Jew." And Ramy says, "That's like not a thing. That's not a stereotype. Jews aren't bad drivers. It's Asians." And then everybody laughs and you're kind of like, huh, okay. So, you know, we see these things in pop culture, we laugh, but really stereotypes are not really for laughs. They are quite ugly. They do vicious cultural work. They suggest that the behaviors and the traits of these people that we're stereotyping are so deplorable, so other, that we don't want to have anything in common with these people. So we have to make fun of them. We have to neglect them. We have to degrade them. We can say that they are the ones who are violent. They are the ones who do something wrong. They are the ones who discriminate, not me. And that has some real repercussions. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to just introduce our speakers. We're going to have some wonderful time to hear from them. So first we have Dr. Siva Subramanian, who is a Hindu faith leader with the Interfaith Council. He also represents the Hindu Jain temples and the Sri Siva Vishnu temple. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Siva. We have Catherine Osborne, who is the executive director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. Thank you for being with us, Catherine. We have Emme and Chris Martin, who are congregational leaders for young single adults ages 18 to 30. They're representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you for being with us. We have Susan Stolov-Weiss, who represents the American Jewish Committee of Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us. We have Shaista Ahmed, who is a federal employee and a member of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, representing the Muslim community. I'm also one of her sisters in that group, full disclosure. We have Paul Tiao, who is president of Communities United Against Hate. So thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Just really briefly, I want to share my screen before we jump in. Let me do that. Okay. I want to show you a quick excerpt from a book, which a really dear friend and mentor of mine called Reverend Robert Chase worked on. So this is just to kind of frame the issue. So his book is called Beyond the Comma, Life at the Intersection. He is a Christian reverend, and for many years we worked together in Pakistan. And we were encountered with stereotypes on a daily basis, both from our side. We were bringing different Americans of all different religions to Pakistan to work with all kinds of different communities. We brought Pakistanis here to do the same kind of work in an interreligious context. And we learned a lot from that situation. And it also showed just how often you can be confronted with a challenging situation in real time and have to make a decision about what you're going to do. So I just want to read this quick excerpt. So this happened in 2012. And I love where he says, social healing involves taking stands that are uncomfortable at best and can even be dangerous. So the setting is, we're in Pakistan for the first time at this university. This was the first time this Christian reverend was going to meet this group of Pakistanis. So he's with a group of kind of officials dressed in traditional garb. I'm not going to read this word for word, don't worry, who kind of were interrogating them to be sure of their intentions. Reverend Chase felt there was a level of intimidation in the room and that there was a little bit of discomfort. So, you know, they're having small talk, they're answering questions, they're talking about interreligious cooperation and how we can work together, saying we're here to build relationships, we want to end the cycle of mistrust, we want to work together, everyone's nodding, everyone's smiling, things seem to be going well. Then a man at the far end of the table says, you're right that there's a great room for cooperation between Christians and Muslims, but we both know the real problem in our world lies with the Jews. Silence. So Reverend Chase says, it was one of those moments when he really had to make a decision. He could ignore it, he didn't want to offend his hosts, or he could really address it straight on. He gave a gentle but firm response. And this is something I think about all the time, which is why I wanted to share with you. That is not my experience. I know many Jews who are deeply committed to interreligious cooperation, including outreach to the Muslim community. In fact, there have been Jews working with us in our outreach to Pakistanis. On this, then, we will simply have to respectfully agree to disagree. That is not my experience. I love this phrase. I think it's non-judgmental. It's a way that opens the conversation rather than shuts it down. So that's why I wanted to share it with you. It it reminds us, as Reverend Chase says, that there are many moments we're called upon to state something that threatens our position, credibility, or power. What we say can alter the course of our entire lives. So just that one phrase that I learned from him, I've always kept in my mind when I'm doing interfaith work, and just wanted to share it as an example. I think we're going to hear really many helpful examples from our panelists today. Our aim is to really send you away with some useful tools that you can use when you're in an uncomfortable situation. So I'm going to be compiling what our panelists are saying, compiling ideas from the audience, and we'll share that out with you as a tool following the conversation so that you can really use it for action in your community. So with that, let's get started. We're going to hear from our panelists in two groups. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Shiva, from Emme and Chris, from Martin, from Susan Stolov-Weiss and Shaista Ahmed. Then we're going to have about 10 minutes for a Q&A discussion. Then we're going to hear from Paul Tiao and Catherine Osborne and have more time for a discussion towards the end. And feel free to enter your questions in because we are monitoring that. All right, so with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Siva Subramanian. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Appreciate it. It's a great session. Thanks, Simi and the IFC for hosting this. And thanks to all the panelists. I think this is going to be a rich session. I will start with Namaste. And you also mentioned it. And this is something that is especially relevant with COVID-19, with both physical distancing and not shaking hands. And so we can still, respect the other person by a gesture like Namaste, where you bring both hands and say, the divinity in you is also, there is a divinity in you. I bow to your divinity from this divinity. And so that is one. And then we always start with any of these sessions, first paying our respects to the teachers. So it is called Sri Gurubhyo Namaha. Guru means is all teachers. And so we always bow to them first. And, I want to expand. This is a no hate in DMV to no hate in the globe. It's not just here. There's no hate anywhere that should exist. With that preliminary stuff, addressing the breaking down harmful stereotypes, there are so many stereotypes that I don't think I have enough time to be able to say it. Maybe we'll address some of them in question and answer sessions. And I will start with one probably that is in the way on top of everybody, in terms of, how many gods do you worship? Is always the question, gods and goddesses. And as you know, in Hinduism, there are different branches, that are there that have different specific deities that they attribute, but everyone always clear and believe in a supreme God. And there is even a saying from Rig Veda, the ancient scripture, Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vidanti. That means there is only one truth. The Pandits call it by different names. And so that is what the Hindus believe in. There is one God. You can call it in any name, but it is the truth. So the truth cannot be different for each religion or each faith, in terms of it. So it has to be. And so then that truth should be reachable for everyone. And so contrary to the misconceptions, the issue of polytheism, it is actually the one supreme being that is given several figures and deities for people to worship. And there is also, we definitely do not have idol worship. We see God in everything. It doesn't matter whether it is a stone or whether it is a picture, or whether it is a tree, whether it's an animal. There is God is imbued in every place. There is nothing that is not imbued by God. So anything can be a representation of the supreme being, which is to some extent is abstract. For many of us, you may not be able to understand that fully. And so, we will give some specific names for each one. And also, definitely Hindus have no idol worship. They are not very idle when they are worshiping. They have lots of, chanting and music and all of those things. So there is neither idol worship nor idol worship, in terms of the Hinduism as far as is concerned. And I will address more of questions that come about this. And but I just wanted to take care of that first. And also, interestingly, from way back, from 5,000 plus years ago, there has always been the Supreme God was represented as both male and female figures. So there was absolutely no problem in terms of having a goddess. In fact, the goddess is the one who is imbued with Shakti, or the power, energy. The male god does not have any power without the Shakti, or the female goddess. So that is another major difference in terms of that we look at, that how people say, hey, you have thousands and if not millions of gods and goddesses. So that is one area of stereotyping that is there, that I hope that you will take the answer of, in terms of, yes, there is only one supreme God, or the truth, and it is represented in multiple ways, in any ways possible. This, not necessarily any particular order. The next, I've already addressed the idol worshiper as well. The next is in terms of, why do Hindus worship cow? This is something that comes up, in terms of it. And this is a very symbolic way. Again, going back about several thousands of years, pastoral care, nomadic life was in existence. And for them, cow is a very, very important animal, even though all animals are important. This one, because it gives milk, and that is something that is very nutritious and that allows people to live. And so this becomes a symbol, and because it eats the grass and then gives the milk, and of the symbol of the earth, the nourisher, and the ever-giving, undemanding provider. And so we have developed over those several thousand years, cow as a sacred. So if you imbue the sacredness, people will not hurt. And obviously, this is something that is very simple. And a natural question that flows from that is, hey, are all Hindus vegetarians? And no, not necessarily. But the vegetarianism is really impressed upon from your childhood as a necessary condition for you to purify your mind and to be able to meditate and be able to move to the spiritual advancement. And so that is what it is. But there are many Indians who eat meat as well. But even among them, not many will eat the cow. So they may eat other kinds of meat, but not necessarily the beef, as a component. And that sacredness is something it is so vital to life. Cow has been for thousands of years. So we have maintained that veneration for the cow. And the other question that obviously it's, please let me know when my time comes down, because I'm a professor. I keep talking, so please show me a timeout sign so I'll stop. 1 minute, yes. So the other major thing is in terms of caste. This is something that a lot of people, have a misunderstanding of what it is. And again, if you go back to the Hindu scriptures called Vedas, Vid means knowledge or wisdom. And the 4 Vedas are the scriptures of the Hindus. And of course, others like Bhagavad Gita and Ramayana are also there. And in nowhere in those 5,000, 6,000, 4,000 years scriptures, you will see any discrimination of anyone because of birth. And it all came because of, like in Europe, the many professional legions that existed. And that's why when Portuguese came in the 15th century, they called this Varna system. Varna is simply characteristics of different people, depending upon what they do. And that characterization is what they came, when they came, they brought the lineage that has existed in Europe, different lineages of different houses in terms of the different ways of, blacksmith and, the different forms of people who do the work. And so they brought that lineage. And so in Portuguese, casta is lineage. And so they attributed all these lineages as casta. So caste, and that's how it came. So it never existed before. And when the Indian liberation came in 1947, the main document was written by what will be considered as untouchable, which is unacceptable. And so the language legally was put in as well, that there should not be any discrimination. And if you actually go now in the cities where everybody lives in like condo units like this now, everybody lives in one same place. There is no separation. And so that is a traditional thinking that was carried on from the 15th century that has been changing over the last several years. But you also have to remember, since it was there with a 700 to 850 years of foreign invasion, and people have to now make those changes. Like, for example, in the United States, when we talked about slavery, and it took several years to make the change. And then it's still taking time to make the differences. And so we will make sure that this is something that we will address as well as many other stuff. I'm going to stop there. And because there are other stuff that we can bring it up in the question and answers. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I hope it at least addresses some of the stereotypes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siva. Yes, we have some questions and we'll get to that soon. Thank you. Now I'd love to introduce Emma and Chris Martin.
Good afternoon and happy Saturday to all. I really appreciated the way Dr. Siva introduced his remarks and specifically noted physical distancing rather than the social distancing that we are often hearing, because I think as faith communities, regardless of your faith background, that this is a time for deeper social coming together and being collaborative. And so I love that we have this day of unity and this connection opportunity to do so.
I think one of the talked about this panel and prepared, we thought, what are the big stereotypes of the church and the people of the church as a community? And one that is probably the most offensive is, and ironically is only within the, for the most part within the Christian community, is this idea that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not Christian, or that they worship a different Jesus than other Christians. I can think of a few things less or more. This is who you worship. You don't know what you're talking about. Never mind the fact that literally the name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's a hill that we find ourselves climbing over and over again. Even folks that I've known for years, we'd have a conversation and their response would be like, so do you all worship Christ? And I'd feel like, gosh, we've talked about Christ on I don't know how many different occasions and just all went over the head. But
Chris, we seem to be losing your video feed. We don't want to miss what you have to say. Can you hear me?
is our volume all right? Can you hear what we say?
Now I hear you. I think your video is just pausing and going a little bit slow.
Okay.
Now I see you. Go ahead.
And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about that
Yeah, we lost you again.
Oh, darn. I'm not sure how to adjust that.
Perhaps we can log out and you can move on to Susan and then we can come back
Maybe
to
so.
us.
That sounds good.
Okay.
All right, we'll get you back soon. Thank you.
Sure.
Panelists, Paul needs to go before 2:45. So is it okay if we change up our order a little bit? And Paul, would you go next?
Sure, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So thanks so much for having me on this panel. It's really an honor to be with this distinguished group. I'm speaking in my capacity as the president of Communities United Against Hate. Our mission is to unite the diverse community to combat bigotry, to promote inclusiveness, support victims of hate in the DMV area. And we do this by working across different faiths, ethnicities, races, sexual orientation, and other groups to combat hate in its various forms. I'm also very active in the Asian American community and for decades have been with the Asian American Action Fund as its executive director and with OCATC. So I'm going to be talking about two common stereotypes in the Asian American community. One is the model minority myth, and then the other is the perception of Asian Americans as foreigners. The model minority stereotype says that Asian American kids are good at math, that they're musical prodigies, that they have tiger moms that force them to work harder than anyone else, and that they grow up to become nerdy Asian American professionals who are in the sciences, in engineering, and in medicine. And you might think, well, that's not such a bad stereotype. Maybe you're lucky. Maybe that's a good thing. But I think that we can all agree that stereotypes are insidious. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. There's a lot of Asian American kids that are actually not good at math and science. And if you're one of those kids, if you're bound by the stereotype, then teachers think you're just being lazy. And they get upset and they hold it against you. And they may not give you the attention that you may need because they just think you're being lazy. And that may contribute to the fact that Asian American college students have the highest rate of attempted suicides among all groups. And if there's a perception that you're a math science geek, then there's also a related perception that you don't have good social skills and you don't have leadership skills. And that became very apparent actually in some recent lawsuits against Harvard. And when you become a professional, and I'm a lawyer by trade, partners at law firms may think, oh, well, you're good at math and science. You're an Asian American geek. And I can't possibly have you talking to a client. You know, you don't have the social skills to deal with clients. I can't give you a leadership position. I'm going to have you go handle tech-related cases, go work on patents and things like that, which are great cases, but that shouldn't be the only thing that Asian American lawyers should deal with. If you're an actor, you may be typecast as an Asian American nerdy IT geek. You may be typecast as a Kung Fu master, but you would very rarely, extremely rarely ever get cast as the romantic lead in a major motion picture. So these are some of the ways that actually the stereotype does hurt you. It also hurts you in the policy realm. Many policymakers don't realize that Asian Americans have significant social needs. 1 in 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented. That is not something that most people realize. And we're having a significant national debate about immigration, and that just doesn't come out. Average income levels vary widely by different types of Asian American ethnicities. So with East Asians and South Asians, they exceed the per capita income of the average white male. But if you're Southeast Asian, and if you're Pacific Islander, your per capita falls well below. So most policymakers are unaware that that's the case. They don't realize that there are Asian Americans out there that have significant social needs. And they may not realize that there needs to be government programs that are promoted, publicized, and talked about in the languages of Asian American communities that speak, so that they can actually participate in these programs. The model minority stereotype hurts all minorities. It's used to suggest that the system works. But the system doesn't always work. And it ignores the fact that there's systemic racism that affects not only Asian Americans, but of course, other communities of color. It also pits persons of color against each other in a way that is socially destructive. And it leads Americans of all types to ignore de jure segregation and discrimination against Asian Americans that has gone on for decades and even actually centuries. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred any immigration from China for 61 years. It wasn't repealed until 1943. The internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them citizens, many of them children and elderly, in California, Oregon, and Washington during 3 years during World War II remains one of the worst civil rights atrocities committed by this government. And that brings me to the second stereotype, which is the perception of Asian Americans as foreigners. This not only has a long history, but it runs deep and wide today. I cannot begin to tell you the number of times that I've been asked where I'm from. And I love telling people that I'm from Wisconsin, because that is not what they're expecting. And, you know, any person of color has encountered racism in this country and you know, throughout their life. And in addition to being called a chink, the most common racist statement that I've encountered in my life is to be yelled at to go back from where you came. And I can assure you, they were not thinking of Wisconsin. So the problem with this stereotype is particularly acute during times of crisis in this country. So in 1982, Vincent Chen, a Chinese-American auto worker, was brutally beaten by several auto workers just a few days before his wedding. And he was being blamed for the Japanese takeover of the American auto industry. On September 15th, 2001, just 4 days after the 9/11 attacks, a Sikh American was the first American murdered as a result of a retaliatory attack for the 9/11 attacks. And in the first month after 9/11 alone, there were 300 reported hate attacks on Sikh Americans around the country. And there have been thousands more since then. More recently, since the pandemic began in the US, reports of hate-based attacks have skyrocketed. Statements by the president and many other government leaders calling the pandemic the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, and blaming the Chinese, as opposed to perhaps the Chinese Communist Party, for not containing the problem and announcing it more widely to the world, have exacerbated these attacks. More than 1,600 attacks have been reported in the last month alone to one of several Asian American collection centers. They include 3 members of a Burmese American family stabbed at a Sam's Club in Midland, Texas in March. 3 people were stabbed, and they included 2 children, ages 2 and 6. Acid was poured on an Asian American woman in New York taking out her trash. She was burned and had to be hospitalized. Death threats against numerous owners of Asian restaurants. Numerous physical assaults on Asian Americans accompanied by racial slurs relating to COVID-19, rampant verbal assault and harassment. 60% of the reports have come from New York and California, but the reports have come from 45 different states around the country. 9% are physical attacks, 70% verbal assaults, 24% involve shunning, barring Asian Americans from restaurants, businesses, and otherwise refuse different services. The rates of attack have been alarming, even with shelter-in-place policies. And as lockdowns are lifted, there's significant concern about a massive rise in already a very high number of attacks. FBI has already issued warnings, as it did about a month ago. And it's really important that government leaders speak out against such acts of hate and discrimination. So there's several congressional resolutions pending in the House and the Senate. Several governors have made strong statements. Local leaders have made statements. Even the president has now made a statement about it. And so we must encourage victims to report incidents to the police, to the FBI, and to one of several Asian American reporting centers. I'm going to flash up a screen here. I can do this, share my screen. And you'll see here, this is one place that you can report a hate incident. These are the 6 centers around the country where you can report these online. You can call in as well. In Maryland, you can call the Attorney General's hotline at 1-866-481-8361. In Montgomery County, the county police will investigate every reported incident of hate, and the Office of Human Rights provides financial assistance to help victims get back on their feet. You can participate in bystander intervention trainings online to learn how to provide safe assistance to persons that are being victimized. Here is a list of bystander intervention trainings that are being offered online by the Asian American Advancing Justice Center. You can do other things like promote diversity and cultural competency trainings, volunteer for a civil rights group, support coalition building, get to know your neighbor, especially those who are different, and learn more about the Asian American community. This month is Asian American Heritage Month, and WETA has got a feature on Asian Americans on several days looking at different aspects of our history and our life. So again, thank you very much for having me on this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. Okay, welcome back, Emma and Chris. We will hear from you again. Thank you.
Hopefully this connection will be a little bit better. We've changed to a new location. And so, but I was saying that one of the things that is stereotypes is probably most offensive to us is questioning whether or not we believe or worship Christ, whether or not he's central to our faith. And I can understand why there might be some questions as understanding.
We lost you again. I wonder if you could call in maybe, like without the video.
Yeah, we could probably try that.
See if there's an option for that. Then how about I go ahead with Susan and then we'll get you back in. We'll get you in. This happens with technology, we understand. See you soon.
Yeah, it does.
All right, I will turn it over to Susan Stolav-Weiss from the American Jewish Committee then.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Give me a second to do that. Okay, I appreciate being invited here to talk about stereotypes and anti-Semitism, what it is, how to recognize it, and what to do about it. And it's especially meaningful to do this today, not just because it's a day of unity, but also because this past week marks the 1-year anniversary of a shooting at a synagogue in Poway, California, in which a woman who's about my age was killed, as well as 3 other people seriously injured. So why am I here today? So this is a photograph of me and my younger sister. She looks like she's about a year old, a year and a half maybe when you're sitting up like that. And that's the first night of Hanukkah, and I'm displaying the gifts that I got for Hanukkah. And you can see that mousetrap game that I'm very proud of, which I thought was very cool, and I actually still have to this day, even though it's missing a few parts. But the reason I'm showing you this photograph is I'd like you to notice the menorah in the window. So in my family, it was a tradition that we would put an electric menorah in the window and light it for every night of Hanukkah. And when I was a kid, we'd drive around the city and I'd be sitting in the back seat on my way to go visit my grandmother. And I'd be looking in every window in all the apartment buildings, looking to see if there were any other menorahs. They were few and far between, of course, but when I saw one, it was very exciting. I still have that electric menorah, and it is still a tradition in my family that we put it in the window of our house. Except this year, when I took it out of the box, I paused and I thought to myself, should I really put this in the window? Am I going to risk ruining the holiday for my family? Am I going to find a swastika on my front lawn? And when I have thoughts like this, I think about my grandmother who came to America when she was 16 in steerage, saying goodbye to her family, never to see them again because most of them were killed. And she would probably say to me, put that menorah in the window and do something about it. So I decided to volunteer with the American Jewish Committee, and it's the oldest human relations organization in the US. It was founded in 1906, and what it does is it advocates for democracy and human rights and the safety and security of Jews worldwide. I don't have to tell you that anti-Semitic incidents are increasing locally, nationally. In just the last 6 months, there have been 3 incidences of vandalism at local synagogues. This is Tikvat Israel in Rockville just a month ago. The security cameras show this young man painting a swastika on the side of the building. Police just about a week and a half ago arrested a 28-year-old Rockville man and accused him of the crime. And then, of course, extremists never miss an opportunity to exploit a crisis online. Anti-Semitic incidents and stereotyping proliferate, most recently claiming that Jews are behind the virus. This meme was posted by a white supremacist and a former congressional candidate in Wisconsin. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see here in the lower right, this is supposed to represent China. And it's showing what they're saying is a big Jewish bioweapon bringing the virus to China. And this is a typical anti-Semitic meme about, which shows that Jews are planning to take over the world, which is a very common anti-Semitic myth. We're going to go into that a little bit more, but first let's take a very quick look at hate crimes in the United States. And before we talk about it, I think it's really important to take note that 60% of the hate crimes in the United States are directed at African Americans. And our country has a very long history of racial discrimination. 19% of those crimes were because of religion, because of bias against religion. And let's take a closer look at those 19% of the crimes. I'm going to give you a minute to look at this graphic because it's got a lot on it. And you'll see, if you look at the pie chart, the orange is based on crimes against Muslims, it's 15%. And about 60% of the crimes based on religion are crimes against Jews, as you can see from the blue section of the pie. So communities that make up 3% of the US population account for 75% of religious-based hate crimes. I want to respect the time limit that I was given, but during the Q&A, if anyone's interested, we can talk a little bit more about how underreported these crimes are and how, in fact, some states have no hate crime laws at all. So what is anti-Semitism? Well, over a period of years, an organization of 34 nations have developed a working definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And it gives about 11 examples of how this hatred is expressed, and they fall into 4 main categories. Hatred towards Jews, and you'll see some of these things, the stereotypes right here in some writing that was put on a synagogue wall. So hatred towards Jews, calling for their death, stereotypes and scapegoating. So here's the stereotype, this is here is supposed to represent money. That includes the use of conspiracy theories saying Jews are globalists who control the media and the environment. Holocaust denial and Holocaust comparisons, again, this is another example of that. And inappropriately invoking Israel, such as declaring Israel a racist state and thus illegitimate and holding it to standards expected of no other state. So let's take a look at some of the common examples of anti-Semitism, because the first tool we can use with all of these stereotypes that we have been talking about, and it's really what we're all doing here today, is all about education. This is a booklet that lists anti-Semitic examples, and it recognizes them for what they are: hatred, bigotry, and discrimination. And I'm going to put a link to this booklet so anyone who wants to can download it. And each page looks like this. And let's take a little closer look, because that's a very busy page and there's a lot on each page. And so the way the booklet is designed is on the left side is an example, a current day example of the use of anti-Semitism. And on the right side, it explains what it is and a little bit about the history. So on the left side here, this is a rock at the University of Tennessee. And painted on it, it says Jews did 9/11 and that they were celebrating after they did it. And then on the right side, here's this more detailed explanation of what that anti-Semitic trope, sometimes we call it a trope or a myth, was. And this one is the conspiracy theory, which is a very common stereotype that Jews are the hidden hand plotting to take over and control the world. And that was central to the rise of Nazism. And the way the booklet is designed, when you download it, you can actually, if you see anti-Semitism or stereotypes online, for example, you can copy and paste some of these explanations from the booklet and put them directly online. So here's another example of the booklet. In the booklet, it says, "You killed Jesus." This is some students at a Catholic school yelled that out when they were playing against a basketball team from a Jewish school. And then on the right side, it explains that, of course, anti-Semitism commonly makes Jews scapegoats, blaming them for everything from the murder of Christ to the 2008 financial crisis to the coronavirus. And here's another example, Jew down. You know, I really hope you all don't see all of these examples all of the time, but this is another very common one. It's rooted in the stereotype that Jews are cheap or stingy. It portrays Jews as greedy money handlers, unwilling to part with their earnings. And the origin of this myth was because at various times in history, Jews were not permitted to be in other professions. They were often limited to jobs lending money. And so this myth goes way back. You know, your probably earliest memory of it is when you read Shakespeare in high school with the character of Shylock. So the tools that we have in our bucket are that we can speak out. And at the back of that booklet, it gives tips on how to do that when you see it online or in your community or you hear it. And we especially need our non-Jewish friends, all of us, to speak out because, as Paul mentioned, you know, only together, forming coalitions and working together, can we overcome hate. So your willingness to be here today and your talent when you walk out of here and you talk to people, I thank you from the bottom of my heart so that no one here is afraid to be who they are. And I look forward to answering any other questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Susan. Emma and Chris, I see you. Go ahead. Oh, I think we are muted. There we go.
So we called in, and so you may need to, we may need to use that if this connection doesn't work. And so we'll start with this and we'll see how that goes.
I don't see the video connection working. Is there a way to turn it off and just use the audio option? There, I see the call.
Okay, you all hear it now? I think this should work.
There you go. I hear you now.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So as I mentioned before, so I think the last thing I said was that we have the Book of Mormon, which is not common to general Christianity. It's a very specific book of scripture. But the reality to us, it would be no different than, say, the Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon. It's just another reference. And in fact, in the Book of Mormon, the subtitle is Another Testament of Jesus Christ. And so it's very interesting that folks focus on the term Mormon. In fact, it's a nickname that is often applied to members of the church. And well, we don't necessarily find that nickname offensive. We prefer to refer to ourselves as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or as Latter-day Saints to avoid this misconception that we're not rooted in a belief in Christ. In fact, the church just recently changed the symbol of the church to more fully reflect that. And so some of you all might have seen that. There was a media burst about it. It used to be, it was just the block format of the church's name was kind of the symbol of the church. Now it's that same block format, but on top of that, it has a picture of the resurrected Christ extending his hands out. So that way, anytime you see the church's symbol, if there's any confusion, this is where our belief is. And it's one of those things that it actually is very interesting in that it can generate good conversation and opportunities to kind of build bridges and connect, which is a positive, I suppose. However, I find it really interesting when I have a conversation with someone who's been a friend of mine for years, and we've talked about faith and different things and seem to agree on so many different things. And yet they will tell me, yes, but we don't believe in the same God. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I tell them. They just simply disbelieve. And that's a hurtful thing. I really appreciate what Dr. Siva said about this idea about truth, and that while there may be different names and different titles for it, ultimately we're pointing towards this one same truth. We're all seeking it. There's one of the leaders in our church said that men do not believe in God because they have proved him. And by God, it could mean whatever divine source you're referring to, but rather they seek endlessly to prove him because they can't help believing in him, because there's something divine in us that reaches for that other divine thing. And I think when we allow folks to have that belief in worship, how they see fit, which is one of the tenets of our church, allow folks to worship and believe how they will, and we will do the same. If we allow that to happen, then I think we all draw a little bit closer to that divinity. And so it's a very important aspect for us. So that's one stereotype that of the ones that offend, I think that's probably the one that could be the most hurtful or offensive, just to say, I know that you worship this God and you think that this is where you're looking, but you don't actually know him, and that's not who you worship.
Thanks. Another stereotype that seems to cover a lot of bases in terms of myths and misconceptions that we have is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not inclusive, that we are very separatist in how we view our faith and view others, and that we tend to be very closed and not accepting. And unfortunately, that simply is not the case. I remember many years ago, before we were married, we actually were doing some missionary work, which again speaks to our inclusion, that we want everyone to know and understand our beliefs and come to rejoice and join in them as they feel appropriate. And as we were doing that missionary service, that voluntary work, someone came up to our table and asked us if there were any Black people in the church. And we literally looked at each other and we said, well, here's two right here. And so while we don't speak to the millions of us that exist, we do exist. Woo. And to that end, be it in the space of racial segregation or inclusion, if it's gender equity or sexuality, sexual orientation, or whatever the case may be, we often do hear that our faith tends to be closed-minded or bigoted or very separatist, and that simply isn't the case. We certainly have a subscription to our doctrines and our beliefs, but again, a key tenet of our faith is that we allow others to believe as they believe, but we invite all of us as children of God and believe that we are all children of God to come and to learn and to engage with us. On all of our congregational buildings is listed, visitors are welcome, and we truly do mean that. Anytime, any place, we open the doors to you to come and worship with us at our meetings and to learn what we believe. And we welcome you to come and sit in the congregation, come and sit and be with us, be they during our Sunday meetings or our weeknight meetings and gatherings. We always want people to feel welcome, and we do our best to open the doors in our hearts to that. Oftentimes people will think, again, that there's just, well, if you only have leadership or only have certain sects of things that look a certain way, that is not inclusive, but it certainly is not the case.
Yeah, I think an important aspect of that is the very things that sometimes our faith is accused of is what the folks are actually perpetrating against us. And I think that's common through all faiths. Like, for example, if they say that someone's not inclusive, when you ask them, well, what do you mean by that? So, for example, we talk about women in the church. They'll say, well, the women in the church are being oppressed. Well, I've asked the women in the church, I talk to them, I'm married to a woman in the church, and she's been very clear if I try to oppress her about what will happen in our household. But in all seriousness, they do not feel oppressed. They feel like, look, this is just how we're expressing our faith. And so I find it ironic that the folks who are saying you're being oppressed, let me liberate you for your own good, are stepping in and saying, I'm going to tell you how your faith should work. I think it's just an inappropriate thing. I mean, one of the things that's often pushed on the other end of that idea of not being inclusive is that we try to force our beliefs on folks. It's true that we have missionaries that go out and they'll knock on a door. Some of you may have even had a missionary companionship knock on your door and say, hey, we'd like to share a message with you. But they're taught and trained and told, look, if someone tells you they're not interested, you wish them well, you move forward. We're not there to compel them. And we teach every member to be friends, to connect with their communities, to build relationships there. Because what we don't want is for folks to forget that we're all children of God at the end of the day. And so the old saying is that which separates us is less than that which unites us. And I think that is very true when it comes to humanity, when it comes to divinity. And so often we find folks struggling to figure out how to balance that out. I had a colleague when I worked for a bank years ago, and one of my colleagues was openly gay, and he did not know that I was a member of the church, but he was an active Catholic, and so we talked a bit about faith. Then he learned that I was a member of the church, and I could just see the lights kind of switch in his mind, and I was like, okay, because he very much, at first, his comments were a little different, a little bit harsh, but I was understanding of that. I could see that there were some misconceptions, and I decided, let's show him who I am, and then he can make a judgment and a decision. And we actually had a great interaction, became good friends, remain good friends to this day, and still have those interactions because, one, I tried not to be offended, right, on the fact that he might have had some misconceptions or some stereotypes that he thought were the case. And then I took it upon myself to say, well, let's show him what we actually believe. And I think the best thing that we can do if you want to combat these things is that when people show you who they are, believe them. That's a saying that Maya Angelou said, and I love her, and that is so true when it comes to faith. And so one of the things that we try to do is show folks through our actions, through our words, through our lives, how we live our religion and what it means. And so if there's a misconception, we're always open to a dialogue and a conversation, because I think that's the important way to gain knowledge and understanding. But once someone has told you and shown you, it's important that we believe. If we don't believe, then we won't be able to make it the right connection. And there are some other issues, for example, about, well, it looks like there are some questions and stuff that we'll deal with soon. And so we'll defer until the question and answer period.
Great, thank you so much for that, Emma and Chris. Panelists and attendees, we're just gonna move on and let all of our presenters have a chance to speak, and then that will give us a good time for Q&A at the end. So we're gonna hear now from Shaista Ahmed.
Hey everyone, I wanted to actually to share that actually I think I've been practicing the Day of Unity because I just jumped off from a Jewish-Muslim dialogue group call, and I will be joining my Mormon sisters later this evening because I believe Mormons fast the first Sunday of every month, and this is the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims. So we all, every year we get together as Muslim and Mormon sisters, and we will be breaking fast together via Zoom, actually. That will be a great opportunity. So I just wanted to set the stage a little bit for the conversation. So just using a bit of a technocrat, so I'll use a lot of data in the conversation. So a Pew study reveals that Americans hold the least favorable view of Muslims. So amongst all faith groups, Muslims come in dead last. And just for a bit of context, going back to Melody's story, Jews have the most favorable view of Muslims, and evangelical Christians have the least favorable view of Muslims, actually. So that kind of sets the stage of how people come to these stereotypes. So goodness, like I guess you could say Muslims really do have their work cut out for us. I'll start with the most innocuous stereotype that many Muslims usually get, is that all Muslims are Arab or from the Middle Eastern background. And actually it's Indonesia that's the largest Muslim country in the world, and after that is Pakistan, then it's India. And American Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith community in America. Approximately a third of American Muslims are African American, and then another third are from South Asia, and a quarter of them are Arab. And actually most of Arab Americans are actually Christian. Now, moving over to the conversation that we're having more as of late, is that can you be Muslim and be a patriot? And so statistics show, actually, I think after our African American brothers and sisters, that Muslims are some of the most religiously observant group. And so about 2/3 of Muslims say that they actually, religion is very important to them, and about 6 out of 10 pray every day. But amongst these very same Muslim Americans, over 90% say they are very much proud to be Americans. So patriotism is very much synonymous with religious observance for Muslims. Now, often as a Muslim, I get directed this question, Muslim women especially, is that does Islam oppress women and force them to be subservient towards men? And I think the best way to answer that question is to go to the more obvious, more conspicuous things that people do direct these particular sentiments towards. And that's like the discussion around the headscarf, and as being an expression of oppression. And so while, yes, it's true that the Quran does direct both Muslim men and women to dress with modesty, how this is interpreted by anyone is someone's personal choice. The practice comes from a traditional interpretation that says the hijab, or like the headscarf or modesty, protects a woman's dignity. But again, it's a person's choice, and there's similar traditions of headscarves and head adornments when it comes to Catholic nuns or the Jewish Orthodox faith as well. But many people think that Muslim women are forced to wear a head covering. And, you know, interestingly, there's study upon study, like most recent Pew study showed that there's approximately 40% of Muslim American women wear a headscarf. And of those, overwhelmingly, 99% of them do it by choice. And they do it because either they want to, it's a symbol of piety or modesty, they choose to do it, or they just do it because they want to actually identify with their faith. So overwhelmingly, they do it on their own accord. And in the countries that, and for the vast majority of Muslim countries where women do wear a headscarf, they do so by their own choice. And it's more of a cultural tradition to do so. Now, not to say that there aren't places in countries in the world, and many know of them, are Saudi Arabia or Iran, where women are forced to actually wear headscarves. But I would say, again, that's because either the government's choosing to push that on to the women, or sometimes women have chosen to wear the headscarf as well, as to signify that their association with the faith. But I will also say this room for interpretation is not unique to Islamic faith. It's true of many faiths throughout the world. But also I often point to when I encounter this question, particularly because my older sister wears a headscarf, I don't. The rest of the 4 other sisters in my family, we do not wear a headscarf, and that subject to interpretation is endemic to many things, right? And so I often point to the fact that, you know, we have a secular liberal democracy in America, and in this secular liberal democracy in America, the understanding of religious freedom that is extended to Americans is that women and men can wear religious adornments when they actually go to school or they're in a government setting. Whereas in the same secular, in a country that purports to be a secular liberal democracy, such as France, that is not true for Muslim and Jewish men and women. Jewish men who wear a yarmulke cannot actually attend a school wearing that yarmulke, or not attend or participate in the government wearing a yarmulke, nor can a Muslim woman wear a headscarf. So they both purport to be secular liberal democracies, but at the same time, they have chosen to define the extent of religious freedoms being extended to those populations quite differently. So you can have differences even amongst similar looking and similar sounding countries as well. And so the other thing is, another way to look at the actual issue of are women being oppressed in Islam? Well, you don't have to actually go too far to look at if a country or a faith is looking to oppress their women. You have to look at the fact that are women in leadership positions, right? And so there are 8 Muslim countries where women have been head of state. Now, America is yet to actually realize that for America, you know, it will be until 2025 when we can reconsider a woman being the president of the United States. But there has been 8 Muslim countries that have had women as heads of state. Also, similarly, the Anti-Defamation League finds statistics. There are many women from Muslim countries who hold various elected positions that are far greater in number than in the United States. But you can also look to educational attainment as another way to see, are women being oppressed? So interestingly, Muslim women in America are second to Jewish women in terms of educational attainment. So we are second to Jewish women in attaining higher levels of education. Similarly, I think there's a sentiment that are Muslim women being educated across the world? Well, Pew did another study and showed that educational attainment across Muslim women and Muslim men has narrowed. So basically, more women are getting educated, and actually in Gulf countries, they surpass men. And they also found, the study showed that actually it's more of a function, not because of the faith, but of the economic strength of that country. So they've been disabusing many people of that particular stereotype through the statistics that are bearing out in terms of the education achieved or attained within those communities. Well, I think this is often never really discussed because it doesn't actually get to, I think, into the part of like the media or discourse around abortion and other topics. But I know that there's a lot of discussions about women's right to her own body, and with respect to is she permitted to have an abortion? And so what's interesting, another thing that I often discuss with people is that doesn't get discussed at all in America and other actual contexts, is that actually in the Islamic faith, women are actually permitted to have an abortion up till 3 months into their pregnancy. This is not a fringe view. This is the Muslim majority view. This is like commonly known amongst Muslim scholars. And so often I know that the conversations that are being had amongst many other religious communities, that this is not something that they would necessarily consider to be extended to the women in their populations. This is not an actual debate. This is actually part of Islamic law, that you actually are allowed to have an abortion if you choose to. But there is often the conversation that I usually have to have with many people, it goes from the woman issue, and then it goes next to the violence in Islam issue. So often it's two heavy issues that you have to discuss, and you have to toggle between them. And often I have to similarly denounce that women are not oppressed in Islam. I then have to have the conversation that Islam is not inherently violent, that just like any other faith group or any other ideology, it can be susceptible to extremism, but in large part, the vast majority of 2 billion Muslims are peace-loving, and very few and far between of them are actually extremist in nature. Actually, I often have to point to research that shows over and over that FBI has reported is that since 9/11, more than 3 times of all violent and extreme behavior has been conducted on part of white nationalists, not Muslims. And so that's severely underreported, and often statistics are not shared because most studies show that the media is skewed more towards a particular bias of representing Muslims as the perpetrators of such violent acts. As you can tell, that the theme has always been with Muslims that we're taking over or creeping, and there's this concept of Sharia creep. And that's a concept that like Muslims are going to take over the country with their laws and their religious dictums. And that's significantly untrue, and much of the data bears out in the sense that there has yet to be any introduction of any kind of Muslim law or a bill to introduce Sharia in any of the states within America. And interestingly, there's been over 200 bills that have been passed and enacted, and only 14 have been enacted, 200 have been introduced, where they've actually tried to ban Sharia. And Sharia law is basically similar to what you'll have in Jewish traditions, which is the halakha law, or the magistrate in Catholicism, which is basically the rules that you honor your parents, that you turn the other cheek, that you love your neighbor as your own brother. It's some of those. Basically, the Sharia, it just kind of ordains. It basically determines how you will conduct yourself on a personal level, but it's not something that you would enforce or push to anyone else. And so that's a common misconception. And actually, Pew recently came out with a study where it showed that it is white evangelical Christians who would rather use their religious text as a source of American law than any other faith group. So this is a sentiment, again, that is misplaced towards Muslims and is more largely held by other religious communities, but is often not reported.
Thank you so much, Shaista, for that rich discussion. Wonderful. All right, let us go to Catherine Osborne, please. And Catherine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, thank you all so much. You can hear me okay? Okay. Thanks so much for all this rich perspective and information and people sharing from their own experiences. So as Melody noted, I'm with Shoulder to Shoulder, which is an organization. It's a coalition-based campaign of 34 different religious denominations and organizations that was formed back in 2010, specifically to address anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States. So I'm speaking from that perspective as somebody who does not myself identify as Muslim, but who works quite a bit on issues related to anti-Muslim discrimination and Islamophobia. And I'll build a little bit on what Shaista was sharing, because there's so much overlap in some of what I wanted to share on stereotypes hitting the American Muslim community in particular. And I think it's really important to note that anti-Muslim discrimination and violence is very multifaceted, like other forms of discrimination and bigotry. It stems from political rhetoric, it stems from media representations, it shows up in legislation, it shows up in hate crimes and vandalism, and it also impacts those who are perceived to be Muslim, not just those who actually identify as Muslim. So we see hate crimes against Arab Christians, for instance, or people who are of South Asian descent, etc. So we see all these overlaps, and I think that shows us, and we can't spend a ton of time on this here, but that anti-Muslim discrimination is racialized as well as it is religious. So it's not just about disagreeing, for instance, with beliefs that you perceive to be held by Muslims, but it's a very racialized form of bigotry as well, and it's interconnected with other forms of racial and religious discrimination. And so anti-Semitism, for instance, is a strong predictor of anti-Muslim views, and vice versa. We see people who hold other types of racial and religious bias, often that is a strong predictor of somebody holding anti-Muslim bias. So we see all of these things as highly interconnected with each other. And as Shaista mentioned, there's really what we see is the stereotypes around Muslims kind of boiling into two major categories. Those talking about the treatment of women within Islam, and those talking about violence. And so there's different ways that those show up. Sometimes those show up as people believing that Muslims don't hold or are not aligned with quote unquote American values. However, they're sort of perceiving those in the moment. But so many of the different stereotypes held against Muslims tend to fall in the categories of women and violence. And both of these are tied up in histories of colonialism, tied up in histories of imperialism and in conflict in different countries. And so they're complicated, and they take time to sort of unpack and learn the histories of various things. But suffice it to say that the data does not bear out the stereotypes and tropes about Muslims when it relates to women and to violence. And I think Shaista shared some really great resources on that. I would point to another that has great resources on American Muslim views and experiences around these issues. And that's the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is just ispu.org. And I can type that in the comments later. I'm not good at speaking and typing at the same time. But they have some really, really great resources. They do polling of the American Muslim community. So they talk about what American Muslims actually believe and what their experiences actually are. And I think those are really helpful in dismantling some of those stereotypes, because the data just doesn't line up with those stereotypes. And yet, the challenge is that no matter what the data tells us, people tend to hold on to stereotypes from a place of emotion. People don't tend to hold on to stereotypes because they really believe that that's what the facts tell them. I mean, you know, we can have different conversations about where these come from, but when people have sort of internalized stereotypes or internalized tropes about some group of people, whether that be Muslims or any other group that we've talked about here today, often they're holding those in a place of sort of fear and emotion, which means that when you're trying to address those stereotypes, people tend to have like what we call a lizard brain response. So we have two levels to our brain. We have the higher rational thinking part, and we have the sort of more emotionally responsive lizard brain. And that's the part of our brain that helps us to watch out for snakes, whether it's actually a stick or a snake in our path ahead of us. It's sort of our quick emotional gut reaction response that allows us to keep ourselves safe in real world experiences, but it's also the part of the brain that kind of makes us solidify some of our stereotypes, especially if they're based in fear and have this kind of emotional response. So when we're thinking about responding to these stereotypes, and we do a lot of this in our Faith Over Fear trainings through Shoulder to Shoulder on anti-Muslim discrimination, but I think it speaks to the many forms of bigotry and stereotyping and discrimination that have been raised by other folks in this conversation today. We need to really think about the psychological reality of how to actually shift people's minds rather than kind of peppering them with the facts, as tempting as that can be to do. And so I'm just going to share, in our Faith Over Fear trainings, we go much deeper into much of this, but I just want to share a couple of points, and I'm going to share a screen just so that it's up there. Oh, sorry, it looks like it's getting cut off at the bottom there, but hopefully you can see it okay. So the four things I just wanted to pull out from the broader sort of training that we do around this work is the first thing really to be finding a common meeting point. So whether that's finding shared values, and some of the research shows us that shared values among many Americans is this idea of freedom of religion. How exactly people interpret that is of course dependent on different people and different conceptions. But if you're able to find that core meeting point, it's easier to have a conversation from there because you found some sort of common ground. So whether that's finding these shared values, and that can be a variety of different things, or other ways of kind of getting inside the circle with the person that you're talking to. So I'm from Kentucky, and sometimes my get inside the circle with somebody who's from where I'm from is talking about a basketball team or talking about other things that we have in common, but really trying to find those ways of establishing some commonality with the person that you're talking with. The second major piece is meeting the emotion, but not the myth. I really encourage folks not to be repeating the stereotypes or the tropes when, of course, we're talking about them here on this conversation because that's part of what this conversation is about. But if somebody comes at you and sort of wants to throw this myth or trope or stereotype about people that you identify with or people that you don't identify with, but sort of a group of people, not necessarily repeating what they're saying. So if I tell you that I'm not a thief, the first thing that you're gonna kind of etch into your brain is me and thief, connecting those two things. And so thinking about not repeating the myth or meeting that, but looking for what the emotion the person is coming to the situation with. Is it fear? Is it fear for safety? Is it highly valuing their family, and trying to do that sort of work of figuring out what the emotions the person's coming to the situation with. And you're much more likely to be able to eventually shift that person's mind on something if you're able to meet them emotionally and help them to feel heard. But that doesn't mean you are validating the thing that they're saying. And so that it's kind of figuring out the dance of meeting them emotionally without validating, for instance, where they think that fear is coming from. The third thing is humanizing storytelling. And this is huge, being able to tell stories, like Melody mentioned at the beginning, this sort of framework of that's not my experience. I have different experiences with people from the group of people that you're talking about, and that it doesn't match up with the stereotypes that you're telling. And it's best if you can tell stories from your own experience, but if you can't, familiarizing yourself with stories so that you can help people connect with different stories. And then a fourth piece, and this isn't meant to be like a step-by-step order, this is just some pointers, and you could kind of start really with any of these, is to gently point out hypocrisy and inconsistencies. And I think about, so I'm from a white Christian evangelical background. And I think about the people from white Christian backgrounds who have committed horrific acts of violence in this country. And yet people do not expect me to answer for them often. People do not blame the entire white Christian community for instance, what Dylan Roof did. And when you're able to point that out to people that a larger community is not blamed for the actions in that, and yet when somebody who self-identifies as Muslim does something violent, people often cast that across the entire Muslim community and sort of feed into that stereotype. And so being able to gently point out those pieces of hypocrisy and inconsistency can be a really powerful turning point for people to look at themselves in the mirror and realize what they would want for themselves and to not be doing the same thing to other communities. So those are just a few of the sort of points of like starting points essentially in addressing some of these stereotypes. And there's much more I could go into, but I know we're coming to the end of time, so I want to leave it for Q&A, but just wanted to share those few tips. Thanks.
Catherine, fantastic. Thank you so much. Those tips are super useful. And I think that's really also what the point about today is to give us some concrete things we can come away with. So we just have a couple of minutes left. I don't think we're going to have time for Q&A, unfortunately, but we'll try to connect with you about your questions later. But to end up, if we could just do kind of a round robin, panelists, if any of you would like to reiterate one or two ways in which people can respond when they hear a stereotype. What's a takeaway you want people to take from this conversation?
So if I can just add or build on what Catherine was saying. So, Muslim community makes up less than 1% of America. So I've realized over time that it's not my responsibility to defend my faith, but rather to disrupt your way of thinking, going back to the psychology of people having these views in the first place. And because I also have to take the responsibility of making sure that others are not they're not being baited towards other faith groups and other communities like my Chinese brothers and sisters, especially post-COVID. And so how I do that is always to contextualize other ways of thinking in their dominant, non-dominant class frames. So basically, one example of what I do, which I'll leave with, is that I often share when I visit Pakistan, many people there often feel like I'm being oppressed as a minority because they always recall the horrible historical record of African Americans being enslaved. And so they just naturally assume that I too will be receiving that similar treatment and may not be having, may not be able to thrive in this country. And so I share back that kind of particular way of thinking so that they can understand that, so that they understand it's a challenge and also put a mirror up to their inherent bias.
Great, thank you, Shaista. I just want to say to all the attendees, we will, if you can, we'll stay on for 5 more minutes after 3:30 to do a couple questions. Panelists, we hope you can stay on as well. Does anybody else want to add a response to a stereotype that people can take away?
Well, I think, go ahead.
Can you hear me? This is Sue. I'd like to add something. I want to sort of add something to what Catherine said, that a lot of stereotypes happen because people have not met people who are different than them. So they have in their mind a blank, and that blank gets filled with stereotypical television shows, stereotypical jokes that people hear. So I just want to stress how important I think it is what we're all doing here today by educating ourselves. I mean, I've learned a lot from the other panelists, and I just think it's been a fabulous discussion. And I encourage you to share the Translate Hate booklet that I just put into the chat too.
Yeah, I just want to add 1 or 2 points, and I think I like the what you shared in terms of that has not been my experience. I think this is something that is very important for a different party to say to the person in terms of that has not been my experience interacting with Hindus, Sikhs, or Muslims, or Jews. I think that's a very, very important thing, because we always have to look at the silent majority. The problem happened because majority were silent. When things were happening that the people were not objecting to, people were not raising their voice. And so that I think is very important, especially in the United States. Many of you have recounted in terms of since 9/11, so many different things have been done. And the same thing happened in the temples, and the Hindus as well, multiple vandalisms and stuff. But I think it is the community that has to come together. And we have been fortunate also that in many of the places where it happened, the community did get together. And that is one of the reasons I've been working with the Interfaith Council for now almost 35, 40 years. And because that is how we can do it. And that's why organizations like IFC needs to be supported, and so that they can come to the support of every other community as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
I guess maybe I'll jump in now. Thanks. So I agree with everything that folks have said just now, and I think it's been a really, really illuminating and interesting conversation, and I too have learned quite a bit. I do think that it's hard for us all to find time to reach out beyond our own community, and so really appreciate the work that all of you are doing, and those of you in the audience that are making intentional efforts to reach out to other communities, to work together, to learn from each other at a personal level, and even as an organizer. I think that one thing I'll mention is that in terms of, when you're seeing something happening, whether it's a stereotype that's being communicated to you, or whether you're seeing somebody that is perhaps under attack, either verbally or physically, because of either the pandemic or whatever's happening. These things happen. Hate crimes, hate incidents do take place, and sometimes we're in a position to actually intervene. I would encourage folks to take these intervention trainings. The ones that I've attended have really emphasized the importance of not trying to attack the attacker, but instead trying to move the person that is the victim into a safer space, and to try to intervene without confronting the attacker, but just try to focus on helping the victim move away physically and out of the space, so that you're not exacerbating and escalating the problem. Sometimes those attacks can result into much more serious attacks where people get really hurt. Most of us are not really in a position to try to defend against things like that. And most of us want to try to avoid escalating. And so I would encourage you, all of you, to take the intervention training, because that is generally one of the first things that we learn, but tend to go against our instinct as human beings.
I just wanted to, we wanted to take a moment. I think, again, one of the key points is when people show you or tell you their beliefs, that we should try to believe them or seek to see at least their perspective of it. I think that's a key and important principle of saying, if I was in their position, I'd hope that folks would at least hear my words and try to understand it, even if they don't agree with it. I think oftentimes we run into viewpoints that say, you just don't understand this. There's a difference between not understanding and not agreeing. And I think a lot of times we confuse a lack of agreement with us with a lack of understanding of the issue, which is a very kind of self-centered point. It's just not accurate, right? I mean, there can be more than one view on a subject. There was a question I saw in the list that I really think I want to address, because I saw it. I could see some hurt there, and I want to be able to address that. And essentially the statement was speaking to the church's stance on what we call a sealing. So there are marriage or sealings inside our temples. We believe that to be a unity for time and all eternity. Husband and wife come together, they get united for time and all eternity. So after death, they continue on as a couple. That's our belief. And the comment saying, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but essentially the question was, why is it that folks who are not members of the church are not permitted to come to those weddings? And what is that? Because that's a hurtful thing. Let me say first, I recognize that hurt, and I'm sorry if that caused any hurt or sorrow in a family. I myself was no one else in my family was in the church when I was married to a man, and so they did not attend our temple sealing, and that can be a difficult conversation to have. Let me explain this. So first, I'll say I can't change a viewpoint on this, but I can explain the perspective as to where we come from and talk about how the church has moved to evolve and address that concern, so that families don't have that hurt going forward. And so first, for us, it's not just folks who are not members of our church. In order to attend our temple, we believe we believe it to be the most sacred place on earth. And we take very strongly the scripture that says that no one clean thing can enter the presence of the Lord. And so In order to go there, we have simple standards that say, if you live according to these standards, then you can attend the temple. And that goes for any member of the church. So I could be a member of the church. If I'm not living according to those standards, then I'm not ready or worthy to go into the temple. That's simply how we approach that subject. And that has not changed. And so it's a misconception. Folks think, well, because I'm not a member of the church, you can't attend. Not so. I will tell you, we had relatives who were members of our church, but who were living their lives contrary to those teachings, and so they didn't attend the temple sealing either. But this is what the church has done. As we've looked at this and thought, we don't want families to feel divided on this subject. We don't want this to cause hurts. And so what we have done now is, because it used to be that if someone were to be married civilly or married outside of the church by the head of their congregation, then there was a waiting period in between when they could go to the temple. That has been removed. And the reason that was removed is so that that very issue is addressed. So if folks have a lot of relatives who are not members of the church, they want them to be a part of that marital ceremony without feeling hurt, they can go and have that marital ceremony and then go to the temple as well. And so we're striving to address that. I think like every other organization of people, a faith is no different in that there are going to be good things they do, there are going to be bad things they do, there are going to be things that go well and things that don't go well. And so I just wanted to address that so that the individual who put out the comment would know that we hear and see that concern. We understand and respect that concern. And that's something that we, the church, are trying to do to be more inclusive. And so we've made adjustments such that that issue and hurt does not have to happen going forward.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that really thoughtful and nuanced response. And thank you to all our panelists. You've been wonderful. You've really left us with some great takeaways, which we'll share with the audience. Attendees, thank you so much for joining us, for being change makers, peace builders, wanting to make the world a better place with all of us. I personally feel energized and inspired by this group. So thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to work for making the world a better place together. Thank you, Simi, to the Interfaith Council for putting this on, and we will see you at the next event. Take care, everyone.
I just want to say thank you again to everybody who attended, and of course to all of our wonderful panelists and our wonderful moderator, Melody. You can always find more information about the work that we're doing on our website. And I will put the link to our website in the chat so you can all get that. Feel free to sign up for our newsletters. And I hope to see you either virtually or in person at future IFC events and continue this and many other wonderful conversations. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.